So Russia is still benefiting financially from that, and it's not clear exactly what more sanctions will do. I think what was interesting, though, Daniel, is that President Trump was also, he had a carrot and a stick. In other words, looking to how could he tempt Vladimir Putin to start negotiating. And one of the carrots was he talked about NATO. He said that he understood why NATO shouldn't be an option for Ukraine. And what is interesting, I think, as a military analyst, is that when in the Cold War, I think it was 1962, the former Soviet Union positioned missiles right on the border of America, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as it was known. America was very unhappy with that happening. So it shouldn't be a great surprise that with NATO moving up to the border, potentially of Russia along the Ukraine border, that is something that Vladimir Putin is not happy with. And I think it was interesting to hear Trump side with President Putin to recognize that was a concern. In other words, it was a slightly different approach that was trying to offer a temptation to President Putin to get involved in negotiations, but also making clear that if he didn't, then things could get a lot worse.
What does it mean from your perspective, this interesting statement of Donald Trump regarding NATO?
Well, again, I think I think you and I have talked before that however much a membership of NATO would be something very welcome to Ukraine, it's very difficult to see practically how that can happen anytime soon, particularly with a large element of Ukraine occupied by Russia. It's very difficult to see how that would work. So although the outgoing President Biden was very clear he wanted to give an opportunity for Ukraine to join NATO. What President Trump is doing is creating a different conversation. He's saying he recognizes Vladimir Putin's concerns and that therefore NATO would be off the table. I think what's interesting about that, and we've not heard anything from your president at all in this space, because President Zelensky has made very clear in the past that whatever the future lies, he may well have to cede territory, but security for the rest of Ukraine is absolutely vital. He's regularly quoted the Budapest Memo of 1994, when Ukraine was offered some guarantees to its sovereignty, and yet 20 years later, Russia ripped the paper up. So President Zelensky will not be happy with any verbal agreement or a signed bit of paper. He'll want to see something tangible. He'll want to see Western nations committing to the defense of Ukraine, because otherwise there's a clear danger. Russia's been an aggressor to Ukraine for 300 years. Why would it stop now unless the West is to step in and help?
Does it mean direct military intervention in Ukraine? And do you think that only US deployment to Ukraine could really force Vladimir Putin to negotiate in good faith to settle the war?
I think the question of military intervention is a fascinating one, Daniel. From my perspective, the West has done enough to try to keep Ukraine in the fight, but not done enough to help it win. I'm very confident that if the West was to intervene militarily with its military advantage, which is an order of magnitude bigger than Russia holds, then Russia would be stopped in a heartbeat. Question is whether America has the appetite to do that. And it's pretty clear, President Trump has already said there is a big ocean between America and European continent. He sees America's focus as China, and he thinks Europe should be focused on Russia. NATO obviously is a lot of countries, but many of those countries do not pay their 2% of GDP spending into defense. Trump is very clear that Europe needs to step up and almost certainly take responsibility for Ukraine in its war against Russia. So I think it's very unlikely we'll see American combatants on the ground. But I was in Europe at the European Parliament only the other week, and it's pretty clear that Europe is feeling a lot closer to the heat of this battle than America is. And I suspect there is more that can be done by Europe to try to halt Russia's advances and potentially get involved in the fight if Putin continues this war.
Does this mean that EU peacekeeping forces could play a key factor in peaceful settlement of the war in Ukraine? What is your take on such idea, or you think that only direct military deployment could solve the problem?
The problem with I'm convinced that President Putin knew when he invaded Ukraine, his strategic risk would have been that the West would get involved, because he would have known that he would fail if that was the case. And that's why every step of the way, Vladimir Putin has threatened the West. He's threatened nuclear war. He's threatened the West with escalations, even though actually all they've been doing is matching what Vladimir Putin has been doing. Putin knows full well that if the West was to get involved militarily, he'd be stuck. Now, Europe so far, because of the political leadership, has not had the appetite for getting involved. Let's be clear, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and therefore there's no obligation to get directly involved. But I know I have several colleagues in Europe in the military regime, and they are becoming increasingly uncomfortable with simply using sanctions and political rhetoric to try to stop Vladimir Putin. They know that the only voice that Putin will recognize is the voice of the military, because he knows he has no answer to that. Whether the political masters have the appetite for engaging in the military fight, that remains to be seen. But every day that goes by, my colleagues in Poland, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Germany are feeling more and more nervous about what the future might hold. And that puts them closer to potentially a decision about considering in getting involved militarily in this fight.
So you're confident that only military options, only military intervention can persuade Vladimir Putin to settle the war, to agree with a ceasefire proposal?
Well, it depends, Daniel, as to what you think Vladimir Putin's ultimate objective is in this war. When I last visited Ukraine a couple of months ago, your colleagues made it clear that Putin's Russia has been at war for 300 years with Ukraine and has sought to destroy its language, its culture, its people, its infrastructure, its churches, everything. And therefore, it's very hard to see, based on that Vladimir Putin will stop just because he has a land bridge to Crimea and has that secure. Almost certainly, most Ukrainians will probably claim that he's going to catch breath and then be prepared to launch again. I think it's fair to say that Russia would not have expected that it would not have taken Ukraine in a matter of days, if you remember back to February of 2022. And Russia has paid a huge price for the land that it has secured. It is almost certainly not able to continue that fight in the near term. So some form of pause, whether it's a ceasefire or an end to the hostilities, probably suits Russia as well at the moment. My worry is that they may suit them in the near term, not in the long term. And therefore, in the long term, something needs to be done to protect Ukraine, to protect Ukrainians, and to stop Russia revisiting this fight in a few years' time.
And what could be a key for ensuring that Russia will not invade Ukraine again in the future after, for example, a ceasefire deal? Only US or European deployment to Ukraine, military presence here?
There have been a number of different options talked about, Daniel, including having United Nations forces on the ground. I'm a bit skeptical about that. United Nations forces are a political tool. They aren't always that effective militarily. And therefore, I think we have to be very careful that if you deploy United Nations forces and Russia decides to push again, that would massively undermine the credibility of the United Nations and the West. I think far more credible will be some bilateral or trilateral military arrangements with Ukraine and potentially the West, whether that's America, the UK, France, Poland, other nations. that all of which deploy maybe semi-permanent forces into Ukraine so that an attack on Ukraine